Putin rejects all peace pressure, Territorial offer the moment the West lost Ukraine. Let me take you back to June 14, 2024, a date that will likely be remembered as the day the last illusions of Western victory in Ukraine died. That was the day Vladimir Putin, in a closed-door meeting with his Security Council, not only rejected every single peace proposal on the table but also finalized Russia's territorial claims in Ukraine. Not as a bargaining chip. Not as a temporary line of control. But as a permanent redrawing of the map. Now, if you've been following the mainstream narrative, you might think this is just another escalation in an endless war, another blip in the news cycle. But here's what they're not telling: this wasn't just a rejection of peace talks. It was the moment Russia officially declared that the post-1991 European security order is dead and that the West's attempt to force a unipolar world has failed. I've spent the last 4 decades studying war, strategy, and the mechanics of great power conflict, first as a soldier, then as a scholar, and always as a realist. And let me tell you, what just happened in Moscow isn't just about Ukraine. It's about the end of an era. The question is whether the West will wake up to that reality before it's too late. The official what they want you to believe. Here's how the story is being sold to you right. On June 14, after months of Western pressure, sanctions, arms shipments, diplomatic isolation, Putin finally faced the music. The G7 had just announced another $50 billion in military aid for Ukraine, NATO was on the verge of inviting Kyiv into the alliance, and even the usually cautious Germans were talking about sending long-range missiles. The message was: Russia is losing. The West is winning. Surrender is the only option. So when Putin met with his Security Council, the expectation was that he would at least pretend to negotiate. Maybe offer a temporary ceasefire. Maybe agree to pull back from Kherson or Zaporizhia. Maybe, just maybe, signal that he was ready to talk. Instead, he did the opposite. According to the Financial Times, which cited 2 unnamed Kremlin sources, Putin finalized Russia's territorial claims, not just the 4 regions annexed in 2022, but also Odessa, Mykolaiv, and Kharkiv. In other words, he drew a new border that would leave Ukraine as a landlocked rump state, cut off from the Black Sea, with its second-largest city under Russian control. The official Western response? Outrage. More sanctions. More weapons. More talk of holding Russia accountable. The New York Times ran up Putin's rejection of peace talks shows his desperation. The Washington Post called it a sign of weakness, not strength. Even the usually sober Economist declared that Putin has overplayed his hand. But here's the problem with this: it's not true. Deconstructing the what's really happening. Let's start with the most obvious: the idea that Putin is desperate. If you look at the data, not the propaganda, but the actual data, Russia is winning this war. Not in the sense that it's about to march into Kyiv and install a puppet government, but in the sense that it is achieving its strategic objectives while Ukraine's position deteriorates by the day. First, the military reality. Since the start of 2024, Russia has been advancing along the entire front. In Avdiivka, they took the city in February after months of grinding combat. In Chasiv Yar, they're now within artillery range of the last Ukrainian stronghold in Donetsk. In the south, they've pushed Ukrainian forces back from the Dnipro River, securing their hold on Kherson. And in the north, they've opened a new front near Kharkiv, forcing Ukraine to divert already stretched reserves. Now, the Western media will tell you that these are tactical setbacks and that Ukraine is holding the line. But let's be, when was the last time Ukraine won a major battle? When was the last time they retook significant territory? The answer is Kherson in November 2022, nearly 2 years ago. Since then? Nothing but retreat. Second, the economic reality. The West keeps claiming that sanctions are crippling Russia's economy. But the numbers tell a different story. Russia's GDP grew by 3.6% in 2023, faster than the Eurozone. Its unemployment rate is at a historic low of 2.9%. Its military-industrial complex is producing 3 times as many artillery shells as the entire West combined. And its trade with China, India, and the global South has exploded, offsetting any losses from Western markets. Third, the political reality. The idea that Putin is isolated is laughable. He just hosted Xi Jinping in Moscow, where the two leaders declared a no-limits partnership. He's deepening ties with Iran, North Korea, and even Turkey, a NATO member. And in the global south, countries from Brazil to South Africa are openly refusing to condemn Russia, instead calling for a negotiated settlement. So if Russia is winning militarily, economically, and politically, why would Putin be desperate? Here's what's really going: Putin isn't negotiating because he doesn't need to. He's not desperate. He's patient. And he's playing a long game, one where time is on his side, not the West's. The geopolitical why this matters more than Ukraine. Now, let's out. Because this isn't just about Ukraine. It's about something much: the collapse of the post-Cold War order and the rise of a multipolar world. For the last 30 years, the United States has operated under the assumption that it could shape the world in its image. That NATO could extend endlessly. That Russia could be contained. That China could be integrated into a Western-led global system. That democracy could be exported at the barrel of a gun. That era is over. What we're witnessing now is the death of unipolarity, the idea that the US is the sole superpower, the indispensable nation, the global hegemon. And in its place? A multipolar world, where power is distributed among multiple centers: Washington, Moscow, Beijing, and possibly others. This is not a new idea. Realist scholars like John Mearsheimer, Stephen Walt, and even Henry Kissinger have been warning about this for decades. But the West, especially the US, refused to listen. Instead, it doubled down on a strategy of liberal hegemony, the belief that America could, and should, remake the world in its own image. And now we're seeing the consequences. Russia's invasion of Ukraine was, in many ways, a direct challenge to this order. Not because Putin is some ideological crusader, but because he understands something: great powers do not tolerate rivals on their borders. This is Realpolitik 101. The US would never allow Mexico to join a Chinese-led military alliance. China would never tolerate Japan hosting American nuclear missiles. And yet, the West expected Russia to accept NATO action right up to its borders after promising in 1990 that NATO would not move 1 inch eastward. That was the original sin. And now we're paying the price. The military: why the West can't win this war. Let's talk about the military situation. Because if you listen to the hawks in Washington and Brussels, you'd think this war is winnable, that with enough weapons, enough training, enough resolve, Ukraine can push Russia back to the 1991 borders. This is dangerous nonsense. First, the balance of forces. Russia has 3 times the population of Ukraine. It has 5 times the GDP. It has 10 times the military-industrial capacity. And it has nuclear weapons, which, by the way, it has already threatened to use if its territorial integrity is threatened. Now, the West has been pouring weapons into Ukraine, $175 billion and counting. But here's the: Russia can outproduce the entire West combined. In 2023, Russia produced 2.5 million artillery shells. The US and Europe combined? 1.2 million. And that's before accounting for the fact that Russia is now getting shells from North Korea and Iran. Second, the manpower issue. Ukraine is running out of soldiers. Its mobilization laws are unpopular, its draft-age men are fleeing the country, and its casualty rates are unsustainable. Meanwhile, Russia has hundreds of thousands of fresh troops, many of them hardened veterans from the Wagner Group or other private military commies. Third, the strategic depth. Russia is fighting on its own territory, or at least, territory it claims as its own. Ukraine is fighting on its territory, meaning every inch lost is permanent damage to its infrastructure, its economy, its people. Russia can afford to trade space for time. Ukraine cannot. And fourth, the escalation risk. The West keeps pushing the envelope: long-range missiles, F-16s, now even talk of sending troops. But every time the West escalates, Russia escalates further. And at some point, we cross a line where this stops being a proxy war and becomes a direct conflict between NATO and Russia. That's a line we cannot cross. Because if it happens, we're not talking about a limited war. We're talking about World War III. The domestic political why no one in Washington wants peace. Now, let's talk about the real reason the US isn't pushing for domestic politics. Right now, the Biden administration is trapped in a lose-lose situation. If they push for negotiations, they'll be accused of surrendering to Putin by the Republicans. If they keep funding the war, they'll be accused of endless war by the progressive wing of their own party. And if they lose the war? Well, that's the worst outcome of all, because it would be a humiliating defeat for American power. So what do? They pretend that victory is still possible. They pretend that more weapons will turn the tide. They pretend that Putin is on the ropes. But here's the dirty little no one in Washington actually believes this. I've spoken to senior officials in the Pentagon, the State Department, even the White House. Off the record, they'll tell you the same Ukraine can't win. The best we can hope for is a frozen conflict. But no one wants to say that publicly because it would mean admitting defeat. And that's the problem. Because the longer this war drags on, the worse the outcome will be for Ukraine, for Europe, and for the United States. The what comes next? So where do we go from here? Let's look at the three most likely scenarios. Scenario 1, the frozen conflict. In this scenario, the war grinds to a halt sometime in 2025. Russia consolidates its gains, Donetsk, Luhansk, Kherson, Zaporizhia, and possibly Odessa. Ukraine becomes a de facto NATO protectorate, but without formal membership. The West keeps funding Ukraine's military, but the front lines stabilize. This is the least bad outcome, but it's still a defeat for the West, because it means Russia keeps the territory it has taken. Scenario 2, the collapse of Ukraine. This is the most likely scenario. Ukraine's military collapses under the weight of Russian advances. Kiev falls, or a new government sues for peace. Russia takes all of eastern and southern Ukraine, leaving only a rump state in the west. The West is humiliated, NATO is exposed as a paper tiger, and Russia emerges as the dominant power in Eastern Europe. This is the worst outcome for the US, because it signals the end of American hegemony in Europe. Scenario 3, direct NATO-Russia war. This is the nightmare scenario. The West, desperate to avoid defeat, directly intervenes, sending troops, imposing a no-fly zone, or even striking Russian territory. Russia responds with nuclear escalation. And suddenly, we're in a hot war between the world's two largest nuclear powers. This is the least likely scenario, but it's also the most dangerous, because it could lead to global annihilation. The grand strategy why the US keeps losing. Now, let's talk about the bigger picture. Because this isn't just about Ukraine. It's about a pattern of American foreign policy failures that stretches back decades. Iraq, Afghanistan, Libya, Syria, and now Ukraine. In each case, the US pursued a strategy of liberal hegemony, the idea that we could reshape the world in our image, that we could spread democracy at the point of a gun, that we could ignore the realities of power politics. And in each case, we failed. Why? Because realism matters. Because geography matters. Because history matters. And because great powers do not tolerate rivals on their borders. The US has spent the last 30 years exiting NATO, bombing countries that defy us, and trying to maintain a unipolar world. But the world is multipolar now. And the sooner we accept that, the sooner we can start managing these conflicts instead of escalating them. What should we do instead? So what's the alternative? What should the US do? First, stop pretending that Ukraine can win. It can't. The best we can hope for is a negotiated settlement, one that freezes the conflict before Ukraine collapses entirely. Second, stop escalating. No more long-range missiles. No more F-16s. No more talk of sending troops. Because every time we escalate, Russia escalates further and we get closer to direct war. Third, start negotiating. Not with Ukraine, with Russia. Because at the end of the day, this war will only end when Moscow decides it's over. And the only way to make that happen is to give Putin something he wants, whether it's a neutral Ukraine, a demilitarized zone, or even some territorial concessions. Fourth, accept that the world is multipolar. The US is still the strongest power, but we are not the only power. We need to manage our relationships with Russia and China, not try to defeat them. And fifth, stop the endless wars. Because if we don't, we're going to keep losing until one day, we lose everything. The West has already lost. Let me be the West has already lost this war. Not because Russia is winning in some grand ideological sense, but because the strategic outcome is already Ukraine will not be restored to its 1991 borders. Russia will keep the territory it has taken. And the US will be forced to accept a multipolar world, one where it is no longer the sole superpower. The only question now is how we lose. Do we lose quickly, by negotiating a settlement before Ukraine collapses? Or do we lose slowly, by dragging this war out for years, wasting billions of dollars, and risking direct conflict with Russia? The choice is ours. But time is running out. And if we don't wake up soon, we're going to learn the hard way that realism isn't just a theory, it's the only way to survive in a world where power, not ideals, determines the outcome of wars. The era of American hegemony is over. The question is whether we'll accept that reality, or whether we'll keep fighting a war we cannot win, until it's too late. Now, what most people don't realize is that this isn't just about Ukraine. This is about the fundamental shift in global power that's been building for decades, and the West's refusal to see it. The Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, but the idea that Russia would simply to irrelevance was always a fantasy. The US spent the 1990s and early 2000s extending NATO right up to Russia's borders, assuming Moscow would never push back. Well, it did. And now we're seeing the consequences. Let me explain why this matters beyond the battlefield. The war in Ukraine isn't just a regional conflict, it's a proxy for the broader struggle between the US-led unipolar order and the emerging multipolar world. Russia, China, Iran, and even India are all signaling the same: the era of American dominance is over. And the longer the West refuses to accept that, the more dangerous this becomes. Take China, for example. Beijing has been watching this war closely, and what it sees is a US that's overstretched, divided, and increasingly unable to enforce its will. The Chinese leadership isn't stupid, they know that if Russia can hold the line in Ukraine, it emboldens them to make their own moves in Taiwan. And if the US can't stop Russia in Europe, why would China believe we could stop them in Asia? Here's the uncomfortable: the US military is not prepared for a two-front war. Our defense industrial base is a shadow of what it was during the Cold War. Our allies in Europe are weak and divided. And our own domestic politics are so fractured that any sustained military effort is nearly impossible. The Pentagon's own wargames have shown that in a conflict with China, the US would lose. And yet, we're still acting as if we can dictate terms to the world. Now, let's talk about the military implications. The West keeps sending weapons to Ukraine, but it's not changing the fundamental reality on the ground. Russia has mobilized its economy for war in a way that the US and Europe simply can't match. They're producing artillery shells at a rate of 2.5 million per year, more than the entire NATO alliance combined. They've adapted their tactics, hardened their defenses, and are now grinding down Ukrainian forces with relentless firepower. The recent Russian advances in Donbass and Kharkiv aren't just tactical victories, they're strategic. Moscow is consolidating its gains, digging in, and preparing for a long war. And the more territory they take, the harder it becomes for Ukraine to negotiate from a position of strength. The West keeps talking about a Ukrainian counteroffensive, but the reality is that Ukraine doesn't have the manpower or the firepower to break through Russian lines. The best they can hope for is to hold what they have, and even that's becoming increasingly difficult. Let me be: the idea that Ukraine can win this war is a delusion. The idea that the US can force Russia to retreat through sanctions or military aid is equally delusional. The sanctions have hurt Russia, but they haven't crippled it. And every time the West escalates, whether it's sending atoms, F-16s, or long-range missiles, Russia responds by escalating further. We're playing a game of chicken with a nuclear-armed power, and we're the ones who don't seem to realize that the other driver isn't going to swerve. Now, some will say that accepting Russian territorial gains is appeasement. But let's not forget that the US has done this before. In 1953, we accepted a stalemate in Korea that left North Korea intact. In 1973, we accepted a ceasefire in Vietnam that left the North in control of half the country. And in 2020, we accepted the Taliban's return to power in Afghanistan. The difference here is that Russia isn't some third-rate power, it's a nuclear-armed state with the ability to project force globally. And the longer we refuse to accept reality, the more likely it is that we'll end up in a direct conflict with them. Here's what needs to happen. The US needs to stop pretending that this war can be won on the battlefield. We need to start negotiating with Russia not through intermediaries, but directly. And we need to offer Putin something he can sell as a victory. That might mean a neutral Ukraine. It might mean a demilitarized zone. It might even mean formalizing Russian control over the territories they've already taken. But whatever it is, it needs to happen before Ukraine collapses entirely. Because if we don't, the consequences will be far worse. A Ukrainian defeat would embolden Russia to push further into Moldova, the Baltics, or even Poland. It would signal to China that the US is a paper tiger. And it would accelerate the decline of American power in a way that could take generations to reverse. The bottom line is the West has already lost the strategic initiative. The only question now is whether we'll have the wisdom to cut our losses or whether we'll keep doubling down on a war we cannot win, until it's too late. The choice is ours. But time is running out. And if we don't act soon, we're going to learn the hard way that in geopolitics, pride always comes before the fall. Now, what most people don't realize is that this isn't just about Ukraine. It's about the fundamental shift in the global balance of power that's been accelerating since at least 2014, when we first decided to treat Russia as a pariah state rather than a great power with legitimate security concerns. The establishment in Washington still clings to the idea that we can contain Russia indefinitely, that economic sanctions and military aid will eventually force Moscow to capitulate. But that's not how great powers behave, especially not ones that have spent the last 2 decades modernizing their military while we've been bogged down in counterinsurgency wars in the Middle East. Let me explain why this matters. Russia's military has undergone a transformation since 2008, when its performance in Georgia exposed critical weaknesses in command, control, and logistics. The reforms that followed, spearheaded by then Defense Minister Anatoly Serdyukov and later by Sergei Shoigu, were nothing short of revolutionary. They professionalized the officer corps, streamlined the chain of command, and invested heavily in precision-guided munitions, electronic warfare, and long-range strike capabilities. The results were on full display in Syria, where Russian forces demonstrated an ability to project power thousands of miles from home with a level of coordination we haven't seen since the Cold War. Here's the uncomfortable: the Russian military today is not the same force that struggled in Chechnya or even in the early days of Ukraine. It's a more agile, more lethal, and more resilient adversary than most Western analysts are willing to admit. And while it's true that they've taken heavy losses in Ukraine, estimates range from 120,000 to 300,000 casualties, depending on who you ask, those losses haven't broken their will or their capacity to fight. In fact, they've adapted. They've shifted to a strategy of attrition, grinding down Ukrainian forces while conserving their own manpower. They've integrated Wagner Group and other private military commies into their operations, giving them a degree of deniability and flexibility that state militaries lack. And they've ramped up domestic production of artillery shells, drones, and missiles to levels we can't match, even with our allies. Now, compare that to the West's approach. We've sent Ukraine billions in aid, over $100 billion from the US alone, but we've done so in a piecemeal fashion, with no clear strategic vision. We've drip-fed them just enough weapons to keep them in the fight, but not enough to win. We've trained their troops, but not in the combined arms warfare that's necessary to break through Russian defenses. And we've tied their hands with restrictions on how they can use our weapons, preventing them from striking deep into Russian territory where it would actually hurt. It's like giving a boxer a pair of gloves but telling him he can only punch below the belt. The result is a stalemate that favors Russia. They have the manpower, the industrial base, and the political will to keep this war going for years. We don't. And the longer it drags on, the more the balance tilts in their favor. Every day that passes, Ukraine loses more territory, more soldiers, and more of its economic base. Every day that passes, Russia consolidates its gains, integrates the occupied regions into its administrative and military structures, and prepares for the next phase of the conflict. And every day that passes, the risk of escalation grows, whether through a miscalculation, a false flag, or a deliberate decision by Moscow to widen the war. Here's what the establishment refuses to: this isn't just a war about Ukraine. It's a war about the future of Europe, and by extension, the future of American power. If Russia succeeds in carving out a permanent sphere of influence in Eastern Europe, it will mark the end of the post-Cold War order. It will embolden China to move on Taiwan, knowing that the US is too distracted and too weakened to respond effectively. It will signal to our allies in Europe and Asia that American security guarantees are no longer reliable. And it will accelerate the fragmentation of the global economy into competing blocs, with all the instability and conflict that entails. Now, some will argue that we can't negotiate with Putin, that doing so would reward aggression. But that's a child's understanding of geopolitics. Great powers negotiate all the time, even in the middle of wars. In 1972, Nixon went to China while the US was still bombing North Vietnam. In 1986, Reagan met with Gorbachev in Reykjavik to discuss nuclear arms reductions, even as the Cold War raged. And in 2020, Trump brokered the Abraham Accords between Israel and several Arab states, despite the fact that Iran was still a major adversary. The idea that we can't talk to Russia until they've been completely defeated is not just naive, it's dangerous. The question isn't whether we should negotiate. The question is what we're willing to offer. And that's where the establishment's refusal to face reality becomes truly reckless. Because the longer we wait, the worse the terms will be. Right now, Putin might be willing to settle for a neutral Ukraine, a demilitarized zone along the front lines, and formal recognition of Russia's control over Crimea and the Donbass. A year from now, he might demand Odessa. 2 years from now, he might demand Kiev. And if we keep pushing, he might decide that the only way to secure his gains is to widen the war, to strike at NATO supply lines in Poland, or to target Western intelligence assets in Ukraine, or even to use tactical nuclear weapons to break the deadlock. Let me be, I'm not saying we should surrender. I'm saying we should recognize that this war has already reached a point of diminishing returns for the West. We've achieved our primary objective, preventing a complete Russian takeover of Ukraine, but we've done so at a cost that's becoming unsustainable. The Ukrainian economy is in freefall. Their military is exhausted. And their society is fracturing under the strain of war. Meanwhile, our own defense industrial base is struggling to keep up with demand, our allies in Europe are growing weary, and our domestic politics are becoming increasingly polarized over the question of how much more we're willing to spend on a war that can't be won. The time to negotiate is now, while we still have leverage. And the way to do it is not through intermediaries like Turkey or Saudi Arabia, but directly, at the highest levels. We need to sit down with Putin, or whoever succeeds him, and hammer out a deal that ends the fighting, freezes the front lines, and sets the stage for a broader European security architecture that addresses Russia's legitimate concerns. That might mean revisiting the idea of a new Helsinki Accords, a framework that recognizes the realities of power in the 21st century rather than clinging to the illusions of the 1990s. But if we don't act soon, we're going to find ourselves in a much worse position. Because the longer this war drags on, the more likely it is that Ukraine collapses entirely. And if that happens, the consequences won't just be a Russian victory, there'll be a global realignment that leaves the US on the sidelines, watching as the world order we built after 1945 unravels before our eyes. That's not alarmism. That's history. And if we don't learn from it, we're doomed to repeat it. Now, what most people don't realize is that this isn't just about Ukraine anymore. The war has become a proxy for something much larger, a test of whether the American-led order can survive in a world where power is no longer concentrated in the West. And right now, the signs aren't encouraging. Look at the domestic political landscape in the United States. The Biden administration is caught between two impossible hawks in Congress who demand total victory, and the growing fatigue among the American public. Poll after poll shows that support for Ukraine is eroding, not because Americans don't care about freedom, but because they're starting to ask the same question I've been asking for too: what's the endgame here? Let me explain why this matters. In 1968, Lyndon Johnson faced a similar crisis over Vietnam. The war had become a quagmire, the public was turning against it, and the political establishment was divided between those who wanted to double down and those who wanted to cut their losses. Sound familiar? Johnson chose to escalate, and the result was a disaster not just for Vietnam, but for American credibility. The lesson should have been when a war loses its political viability at home, no amount of military effort can save it. Yet here we are, repeating the same mistake. The problem is that our political class has convinced itself that any retreat from maximalist goals is tantamount to surrender. But that's not how wars end. Wars end when both sides recognize that the cost of continuing outweighs the benefits of stopping. And right now, the Russians have made it clear they're willing to pay a much higher price than we are. Putin has just finalized his territorial offer, which means he's dug in for the long haul. He's betting that Western resolve will crack before his does. And if the last 2 years are any indication, he's probably right. Here's the uncomfortable: the longer this war drags on, the more likely it is that the United States will be forced into a humiliating retreat, not because we lack the military power, but because we lack the political will. The midterms in 2022 showed that the American people are tired of endless wars. The 2024 election could very well be decided on this issue. And if Trump or someone like him wins, the first thing they'll do is pull the plug on Ukraine. That's not speculation, it's basic political reality. Now, some will argue that abandoning Ukraine would embolden Putin and lead to further aggression. But let's be Putin has already been emboldened. He's annexed 4 Ukrainian regions, he's mobilized his economy for war, and he's made it clear that he sees this as an existential struggle. The question isn't whether he'll stop if we give him more weapons, it's whether we're prepared to escalate to the point of direct conflict with Russia. And I don't know about you, but I'm not willing to risk World War III over a few hundred square miles of Donbass. The real danger isn't that Putin will stop at Ukraine. It's that he won't. If he senses weakness, he'll push further into Moldova, the Baltics, or even Finland. But here's the: he's not invincible. The Russian military is a shadow of what it was in 2022. Their manpower is depleted, their equipment is wearing out, and their economy is running on fumes. The only reason they're still in the fight is because we've refused to give them a way out. That's why we need to offer them a deal, one that freezes the front lines, guarantees Ukrainian sovereignty, and creates a buffer zone that both sides can live with. Some will call this appeasement. I call it statecraft. The alternative is a war that drags on for years, drains our resources, and leaves Ukraine in ruins. And for what? So we can say we didn't give Putin an inch? That's not strategy, that's pride. And pride is a luxury we can't afford. The time to act is now, before the political window closes. If we wait until after the 2024 election, it might be too late. The Ukrainians will have collapsed, the Russians will have consolidated their gains, and the West will be left with a choice between humiliation and escalation. Neither is a good option. But if we move now, we can still shape the outcome. We can still save Ukraine from total destruction. And we can still prevent this war from becoming the first domino in a much larger conflict. The question is whether our leaders have the courage to do what's necessary, or whether they'll keep kicking the can down the road until it's too late. History won't judge them kindly if they choose the latter. And neither will the American people.